Good afternoon. Thank you for joining this webinar today. I'm going to get us started by talking about racial residential segregation. I have three goals. First, I'm going to give you a short primer on what the patterns of residential segregation look like in the Chicago metropolitan area and throughout the state. Second, I'm going to shift away from an emphasis on segregation and talk about integration. And within that, I'm going to highlight three challenges that the research on this topic suggests communities face when they're trying to increase residential integration. These aren't the only three challenges faced by communities trying to do this, and during Q&A we can talk about the others, but I don't want to overwhelm you with all of the challenges. We're just going to focus on three of them today. And third, so as not to end on a negative note, I'm then going to suggest an opportunity that our research also suggests is there in terms of fostering integrated communities. After I do this, I'm going to turn this over to my colleagues John Diamond and Amanda Lewis, who are going to turn to a discussion on schools. So first, the primer. Racial residential segregation, the idea that blacks, whites, and to a lesser extent other racial and ethnic minorities don't share residential space with each other, has been called a structural linchpin of persistent racial and ethnic inequality in America today. Despite the progress in civil rights over the past 4 decades, both actual and symbolic, blacks and other racial minorities still don't earn as much, live as long and as healthy, have as much accumulated wealth, or get as many years of education as whites. A whole host of social, physical, and economic data can be shown to tell this story, but I'm not going to show you that data today. Because where you live shapes to such a great extent where you work or you can work, what kind of health care you get, your exposure to environmental hazards, where your kids go to school, your risk of being a victim of crime, the list goes on and on. An important indicator of whether or not we have racial equality in the United States is the level of racial residential integration. And lots of research demonstrates negative consequences of the opposite of persistent racial residential segregation. In addition to achieving social justice for racial and ethnic minorities, residential integration, in theory, also creates the conditions that social psychologists tell us are necessary for harmonious intergroup relations. For example, working together on common goals to solve problems, members of different racial and ethnic groups can break down stereotypes and negative attitudes about each other, and this can happen when people are neighbors. So to give you the primer, to give you the picture, give you the image of segregation in Illinois, I'm going to start with the city of Chicago, where we have most of the data that have been, most of this research has been done with respect to segregation in the state of Illinois. So the little pink dots represent white people, blue are African Americans, green are Asians, and orange are Latinos. As you can see from this vantage point, this bird's eye view, there are distinct areas where different groups live. You have the sort of spokes of orange coming out from the middle of the city, this interwoven with the spokes of blue to the west and the south, and then a very strong pink to the north. And then, of course, you have the suburban areas outside the city of Chicago that are overwhelmingly pink. So this is illustrating to you the extent to which people live in different neighborhoods throughout the region. How does this look the same or different from the past? The next slide is going to show you that using numbers instead of this pretty picture. So this chart shows how the levels of segregation have or have not changed from 1980 up until 2010. So if you look at the top blue line, which shows segregation of blacks from whites, I'll talk you through what these numbers mean. The numbers are referring to something called the index of dissimilarity. The easy way to interpret this is to say that it ranges from 0 to 100, with scores above 60 are traditionally viewed as considered high levels of segregation. In essence, this index measures how evenly distributed people are throughout an area based on their size in the population. So imagine that you have a city that's 40% black and 60% white. To be evenly distributed, to have a score of 0 on the index of dissimilarity, every neighborhood would have to have 40% blacks and 60% whites. Such a place, like I said, would have an index of dissimilarity of 0. So if you look at 1980, the number 88.6, how do you interpret that number for black segregation from whites in the metropolitan area of Chicago? This means that in 1980, 88.6% of white people would have to move to a different neighborhood in order for each neighborhood to have the percent of whites in the neighborhood that reflects how big they are in the population. In other words, a whole lot of people have to shift places for there to be integration. What you can notice now that you understand what these numbers mean is that from moving from 1980 to 2010, the blue line has dropped. although not tremendously, and it still falls at 75.9, which is still well into the range of highly segregated. The other message from this is to notice that Latino white and segregation is much lower than Black white segregation, and Asian white segregation is even lower than Latino white segregation. And neither of those numbers have really moved very much. There's certainly a trend in the same direction as there is for Black-white segregation in terms of reductions, but it's not dramatic. Now I want to move outside of the Chicago metropolitan area and look at the rest of Illinois. Much less research has been done on places outside of the Chicago area in terms of segregation, but in 2004, I prepared a report based on the 2000 census. There's a link to the report at the bottom of this slide. Things probably have changed somewhat from 2000 to 2010, but I think the big picture, the broad strokes is probably the same. So the first set on the left-hand side shows you the patterns for Black-white segregation in metropolitan areas that are outside of the Chicago metropolitan area. You're going to notice that not all such places are on this list, because these scores can't be calculated unless there's some minimum number of African Americans, or in the case of the chart on the right, Latinos in a community. So where there aren't enough Blacks or Latinos to reliably calculate this number, they don't make it on this list at all. But again, not to spend too much time on the details here, you can see in broad strokes that the patterns in the Chicago metro area are quite similar in the sense that there are a reasonable chunk of cities, Decatur, Springfield, Rockford, Rock Island, and Kankakee, et cetera, that fall in the highly segregated levels that are not in the city of Chicago. You can see that on the right-hand side, there are fewer places that have sufficient Latinos to calculate these rates, but you can also see that similar to what happens in Chicago, there are fewer places that are highly segregated between Latinos and whites, although there are some, as you can see on the table. The second table now moves us to smaller population density places, non-metropolitan areas. And again, the same sort of flavor happens in the sense that African Americans and whites are highly segregated from each other in about half of the non-metropolitan places in Illinois. Those are the ones marked in red on the bottom. And that again, the message that Latino white segregation, though there are moderately segregated places, there are none that are highly segregated at the same level that there are for Black-white segregation patterns. Okay, so that was your primer. Now we're going to turn to the three challenges. There are many forces that create these segregated neighborhoods, and the story is complicated. We often frame our discussion of the causes of segregation around three basic factors: money, discrimination, and people's preferences. Today, though, I'm going to frame my discussion around the flip side. How do we nurture integration? How do we break down the patterns of segregation to encourage foster diverse neighborhoods? This will raise, in important ways, these three factors of money, discrimination, and preferences, but I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle. The first of these challenges I want to offer addresses the question of how people perceive communities and whether the racial composition of a place matters when a person thinks about a community. The idea is that some people maintain that race doesn't matter anymore. When people, especially whites, say they don't want to live in a Black or integrated neighborhood or a Latino neighborhood, the argument goes, it's not about the race of the person, it's about the qualities they assume the neighborhood will have. In other words, it doesn't matter who lives in the neighborhood. What matters is whether it's a nice neighborhood. In 2004, we did an experiment to test this basic argument. In other words, that it's really about the class characteristics of a place, and if you had the same class characteristics of a neighborhood and the only thing that was different was who was living there, you would have no differences in people's evaluations of those communities. So we showed them a random sample of Detroit and Chicago area residents, some short videos of unnamed neighborhoods. And some of them, half of them were assigned to see the first video that you're going to see. So the short videos are pans of a neighborhood where there are people walking down the street. In this case, there's a car being fixed, and the homes look reasonably well taken care of with a couple of blemishes, some neighborhood, one house with no garage door and the like. And the only thing that's different, the absolutely only thing that's different between the two videos is whether the race of the people, the 5 people that are shown in the video, are Black or white. And what we were interested then in saying is if it's really about the characteristics of the neighborhood, then who is walking down the street should not matter. So a person was randomly assigned to see either the video with white people walking down the street, the video with African American people walking down the street, or a video that had both blacks and whites in it. What we found for whites was that we found overall that race does matter. Everybody wants to live in the nicer neighborhood, but even above and beyond those social class characteristics, race mattered. For whites, it was the white version of the neighborhood that was the most desirable one, and the black version of the neighborhood was the least desirable one. The white version was also rated as safer, having better schools, higher housing costs, and more rapidly increasing housing values than the all-black neighborhood. For African Americans, race also mattered, but it mattered half as much and in different ways. The mixed and all-black neighborhoods were equally desirable, and both were more desirable than the all-white neighborhood. For African Americans, race did not affect perceptions of safety or home values, but white and mixed neighborhoods were viewed as having better schools than all-black neighborhoods. The mixed neighborhood was viewed as having the best prospects for increases in housing values. So the example I just showed you illustrates the power of race mattering when the situation is hypothetical. These aren't places that anybody has ever been to, although some people sometimes say they have been there. Now I want to make it more concrete by asking about real places that have real reputations and real histories. So to illustrate this second challenge, I want you to think about the neighborhoods in your communities. How would you describe them to someone who is new to your area? What kinds of things would you mention? You might give a global assessment of how some are good neighborhoods and others are not so good neighborhoods. You might be thinking in terms of characteristics like its shopping availability, the houses, whether it has a good nightlife, how safe it is, how peaceful, how expensive. One thing we know from research is that a community's racial composition also figures into the perceptions and reputations people have about communities. And what this looks like depends on the racial background of the person doing the perceiving. It shapes in important ways what they think about a community. For example, in this same survey of Chicago area residents, we showed them this map and asked them to identify the communities. And one map, we asked them to identify the communities they would seriously consider living in. And then we gave them another map and asked them to identify the communities they would never consider living in. And we found that which communities fell into which category depended both on the racial identity of the person doing the rating and on the racial composition of the community that they were rating. This was true even after we took into account other community characteristics like school test scores, crime rates, and housing values. So these same kind of indicators of social class did not, above and beyond those characteristics, race still mattered in whether someone thought it would be a desirable place to live or not. So to be sure, communities with higher property values and better test scores were more likely to be seriously considered by people of all racial backgrounds. But it was also the case that race also mattered. Whites were less likely to seriously consider a neighborhood that had higher percentages of African Americans and Latinos. African Americans, for their part, were more likely to seriously consider communities with greater percentages of African Americans, but Latinos were generally unaffected by a community's level of Latino residents. So challenge number 2 to creating and fostering integrated neighborhoods is that places have reputations and race shapes those to some extent. If they impact where people of different racial and ethnic groups will move to, then it is a challenge to integration. As a segue into my third challenge, let me show you what happened when we asked the same random group of people who said they would or would never consider living in one of these communities on the map, specifically Homewood Flossmoor. For those of you outside the metro area, Homewood Flossmoor is a racially diverse middle-class southern suburb. For their part, African Americans, what you're seeing here are the themes that they mentioned about why they would, in the case of African Americans, would like to live in Homewood Flossmoor because of its community environment, the housing, and schools. For their part, whites and Latinos have the same 3 reasons for not liking it. For them, it's isolated, it's unfamiliar, and it's too far away. So knowledge, or the lack of knowledge, comes through. People are simply unfamiliar with these communities, so they don't want to live in them. So this brings me to challenge number 3. It's hard to move to a place you've never heard of. Think again about your own community. Depending on how large or small it is, it's likely there are some places in that community that people don't know anything about. When people are making decisions about where to live, it's difficult, though not impossible, to move to a place you've never heard of. It turns out that knowledge of places where people have and haven't heard of is also structured along racial lines. So we showed this same map to people, and on this map we said, mark off any communities you've never heard of, you know nothing about. And we discovered what we call racial blind spots. That is, the racial background of a person and the racial characteristics of a community again influence whether someone is even aware of that community. We found in general that all groups tend to know more about, not surprisingly, where their own group predominates. They know about those places more to a higher degree. But whites' blind spots also include communities that are racially diverse, even some that are majority white. So it moves against whites moving into those diverse neighborhoods if they've never heard of them. African Americans' blind spots are communities that are both geographically distant and overwhelmingly white, those two things together, not either one independently. That works also against integration. But generally speaking, blacks knew more about communities of all kinds than do whites. Latinos have more blind spots than African Americans and whites, and they include overwhelmingly white, racially mixed, and overwhelmingly black communities. Challenge number 3 then is that people have imperfect knowledge about the options in their area, housing options, and they're shaped in part by race. To the extent that not all racial and ethnic groups know about places, then demand from all groups will not be there and integration will not be nurtured. Enough about challenges. Let me end on a slightly more encouraging note, and that is that by and large, people say they want to live in diverse neighborhoods. This is a change from the past and one that we could conceivably build upon. To give you a quick look at this idea, I'm showing you the results again of this same Chicago metropolitan area study, and we asked residents to construct their ideal neighborhood, the neighborhood that had their ideal racial composition. And when you take the average responses for whites in this case, that on the first chart I'm showing you, we can see that whites' ideal neighborhood is integrated. Whites are in the majority, they're 53% of the average neighborhood that they construct, but the rest of the neighborhood is about evenly split among the 4 other racial groups we asked them to consider in their neighborhood. African Americans' ideal neighborhood is also diverse. Their group, African Americans that is the largest group in the neighborhood, but it's not the majority of the neighborhood at 40%. Whites is the second largest group, and then there are also Latinos in 16% of the average neighborhood is Latino, and then a few Asian Americans and a token Arab American. Latinos too create diverse neighborhoods when they construct their ideal neighborhood. Latinos and whites are of the same size, and then they sprinkle in the other groups as well. So the opportunity is that people say they want diversity, and the challenges are to get people who profess an interest in living in these diverse neighborhoods to actually move into them. So I want to quickly end on some thoughts about what a community can do when it thinks about the implications of the challenges that I've just discussed. The first is acknowledging that race still matters. Racial stereotypes still influence, especially whites, perceptions of communities, and the same neighborhood with the same amenities can be read very differently simply because of the race of the residents. The goal of communities should be to figure out how to break down these kinds of stereotypes and acknowledge that race matters. Secondly, figure out if people know about your community. Racially and ethnically diverse communities need to market themselves to break down blind spots, to make sure that people of all races and ethnicities are creating demand for their community, and they need to assure that their community remains attractive and well known to people of all backgrounds. Segregated communities, and here I'm talking about segregated white and segregated black and segregated Latino communities, need to include programs that provide housing counseling to be sure that people of all races and ethnicities know about their communities, not just those who are in their majority. Finally, figure out what people think of your community, understand what reputations your communities have among those who live there and among those who might want to live there. Identify what people perceive are your community's strengths and weaknesses, and figure out if these are the same for all racial and ethnic groups. Specifically, is your community welcoming of people of all races and ethnicities, both in word and in deed? On that point, let me end with one concluding thought on that point about being open to all groups in both word and in deed. We know that one barrier to integration is housing discrimination, which still exists. So enforcement of anti-discrimination laws is a given for efforts to achieve racial integration. There needs to be a welcoming reputation, and the reality must match that. So efforts to eliminate and root out housing discrimination in your communities are important. At the same time, even in the absence of racial discrimination, there are other forces operating to maintain segregation, some of which I've tried to describe to you today.